Hi, everybody. Greetings from my cabin. You can see the woods in the back. One of the reasons why I moved to California was to be in the redwoods because it's my favorite ecosystem, and this cabin is my sanctuary. You can probably see just to my right Lola Bear. She's a rescue. Uh, Boxer American Bulldog mix. And you can imagine just how stubborn she is. So she probably will make a cameo at some point if she wants something because she'll just nudge my head. But in the meantime, just say hi. So we obviously met synchronously for our first meeting just to kind of go over the expectations of the course. And I'm going to keep this video rather brief because largely what we are doing in the very beginning of our course is just reading. And the reason for that is, as many of you have already kind of noted, we do not know much about Indigenous history in the United States and in North America. Our knowledge is very limited to a set of preordained narratives. Um, we also don't know much about the Europeans who came to the North American continent in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. We have our colonial histories, right? But we don't have our pre-colonial histories typically, and we certainly don't have indigenous histories of this time. So our course is really mapping out a lot of information that we probably have never encountered. We may have an intuitive kind of idea that a lot of the information of this historical period has never been disseminated to us. We might even begin to speculate why. Um, but we're going to talk about those speculations and historiographies next week. This week is really just getting us up to speed on what the hell happened. Um, and understanding that it wasn't just the first Thanksgiving, it wasn't just Plymouth Rock, it wasn't just Jamestown. And in fact, um, the way that our text lays it out is very interesting because one, it introduces us to the concept of settler colonialism, which is a very particular kind of colonial nature, and defines it for us. And so of course we're going to be reading that, and I mean, you're gonna be engaging in those pages and performing reading responses as a way to kind of retain some of that material. So I'm not going to lecture on something that you can read, yeah, but we definitely want to become familiar with those concepts. And then in chapter 1 of of the text, which I'm also asking you to read, we get a little history of and a very general one. I mean, let's be real, of the indigenous histories prior to Columbus's uh, encounters in the Caribbean, and what eventually becomes, the advent of Europeans settling into what is now understood to be North America. So we're getting some pre-Columbian history. What's fascinating about history is that it is deemed as fact, and we're going to talk about this more next week, but it is only what is written that is studied and what is perpetuated. We largely know that a lot of the indigenous communities did not record history via a written language. It was passed down orally, or it was passed down visually, or in performance. So we're talking about cultures that were more performative and visual and oral. By no means does that make them less sophisticated. Only in a culture of the written word do we deem the written word as being the most sophisticated. We can imagine that, right? There's incredible sophistication in the dissemination of histories and information and ancestry through performance, through oration. I mean, those are just as sophisticated models, right? However, because European culture primarily was a culture of the word, the written word was given kind of tantamount prioritization. And therefore, the writing of history is the way that we understand and study history. And as we know, if the people who are writing the history privileged a certain kind of set of values, then we are only going to be getting information that privileges their values. Um, History, though, in its attempts to be somehow an objective record of the times of a place, we understand they're largely biased based on the fallibility of the human beings that record it, right? We select certain informations, we omit certain informations, and therefore we have a very limited history of the indigenous communities prior to European settlement. So we need to read about them, yeah? And that is what we are largely doing for today, for today. Um, and then, of course, like I mentioned, encountering some of the concepts that revolve around settler colonialism. Okay? So you want to read those, as well as Fihiko's encounters of, the two communities. So documents of them encountering one another as a form of historical document as well. What we are trying to do is paint a portrait of the very beginnings of all of this. Because as we know, the beginnings set the stage for what evolves. And next week, we are going to be getting into a lot of European history that begets the characterizations that lead to settler colonialism and how it affects North America. But for now, we are learning a little bit about the indigenous communities and about the concepts. Then, of course, I asked you to read, view the Oatmeal's graphic essay "Believe," and this is largely providing coverage of the idea of the backfire effect. Um, Whenever we encounter information that pushes against what we largely conceive to be truth, we engage in the backfire effect. And I imagine that over the course of this quarter and next quarter, we are going to be encountering histories that largely contradict or subvert that which we have already grown to understand or learn, or maybe even embodied as truth. So it's really important for us to be cognizant of this psychological condition of the backfire effect. Um, Now, we probably have enough knowledge and information to understand that we didn't get the entire picture of the indigenous history and the colonial history in high school, in middle school, and elementary school, right? We probably know that. We probably intuit that. There is enough mediated document kind of challenging the notion of that limited history that Americans typically receive. And I would imagine that you have intuition about the tribulation that exists, for lack of a better term, um, of the genocides and the devastation that the indigenous communities experienced as a result of the European occupation and the results of settler colonialism. So you might not be having much backfire effect on the information that we have thus far. However, there are probably going to be instances, moments where that does come into play. And that's the reason why we explore that idea initially in our class, just to be aware that we might have that experience. And I want to issue forth an assuagement here. It is okay to have the backfire effect. What's not okay is to ignore information that is presented to us because we don't want to believe it, right? But I think it's really important for us all to pay attention to when we might have those kind of proto feelings of the backfire effect. Not so much so we can feel bad about ourselves, indeed, the opposite, so that we can then engender a conscientiousness whenever we do feel that, so that we can address it and understand why we have it, what ideologies are at play within ourselves that are influencing that feeling, so that we can examine it and we can understand where it comes from. And if we do not like it, right, or we don't think it's appropriate, then we address it. But more important than anything is, like one of my rules, look life in the face and accept it. If you are feeling the backfire effect with any of this information, record that, consider that, make sense of it. Don't push it away. Don't be ashamed of it. Don't feel bad about having it. The more we recognize how we feel honestly, the more we then can address the circumstances of our challenges and the information that we encounter. Think about how often we might have the backfire effect when we are viewing media, when we are watching the news. What we don't want to do is push it away, reject it. We want to sit with it. We want to look it in the face so that we can understand how much of our resistance or our feeling of backfire is the predilections that we have developed as a result of our upbringing or our dominant ideologies, and how much of it is intellectual, how much of it is emotional, how much of it is based on ignorance. And the more that we can face that, the better citizens and human beings we become. It's not just about being wrong or feeling guilty. It's about embracing our ignorance when we know that we possess it, so that then we can come into the light. So be aware of that. We all have the backfire effect at times. It doesn't make us bad people. What makes us bad people is when we ignore it. Yeah? I'm going to leave us there. Next week, we are going to be going more into history and historiography. And so we will have more kind of material to unpack, and my lectures will be a little bit more content driven. But for now, ingest all of this info, process it, and you'll notice that our reading responses are largely you kind of taking this information and then kind of funneling it through yourself and then recapitulating it in the way that you understand it. And the reason why these are open forum responses is so that all of us can read the way that we are processing this information, because that in itself is moving towards understanding. And that's, of course, what we want to do. So enjoy the readings. I know they're not exactly a beach read, but be impacted by the readings, be inspired by the readings, allow them to inspire questions in you, and pay attention to those questions. They may be something that you want to investigate further, certainly to begin to understand who we are as Americans, who we are as dwellers in North America, um, in light of the history of settler colonialism. All right, you all, be safe, and I'll talk to you soon.